thank you so much for joining today, for taking time out of your busy day to join us this lunchtime. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ruth Tank. I'm a director at Epion Consulting. Serena's saying she's just taken a bite out of a mince pie. Good on you, Serena. So yes, Epion Consulting, we are a specialist business change consultancy. We work with organisations going through complex change, usually, to support those who are impacted to embrace and embed that change. So the background to this webinar is that for a while I have been a little uncomfortable about the way that we tend to think of change resistance on our programmes. And we seem to spend a lot of time, quotes, managing it, but less time really understanding why people resist change in the first place. So I've spent the summer, I went off into the academic literature, and I found that there isn't one reason why we resist change. There are actually a number of reasons. And I've pulled those together into this friction factors model. I'm going to give a high-level overview of that today, but there is also a detailed white paper. It became a little bit of a beast. It's long, but it does summarise a lot of research on this topic and provides a foundation for some of the concepts that I'm going to go over today. So let's start with an assumption. Change is hard, right? This seems to be something that we take for granted, particularly as change practitioners or change leaders. We expect change to be hard. But on the right-hand side, you can see a photo of my actual kitchen. On the day that I moved into my new house, and I'm pouring myself a mug of champagne, as you do, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that despite the fact it was a huge change, I was over the moon. I did not resist that change at all. And in fact, there are loads of changes that we embrace with open arms, whether that is a new job, potentially, or it might be a new gadget, a new phone, a new piece of kit, something that we're really excited to get out of the box, or a new relationship, new partner. These are things that can involve sometimes very, very profound changes, and yet we don't resist them. So this assumption that change is always hard is clearly not the case. It's not true. So there must be other things that are going on that make us, if you like, resist change. So in this session, I'm going to cover off 4 reasons why change sometimes and only sometimes feels hard. It's grounded in behavioural science. There's lots of different areas that I've drawn from: economics, sociology, neurobiology, psychology, and other areas, lots of evolutionary theory as well. There are some interactive quizzes. I'm not sure if the technology is actually working at the moment, but on some of the slides, you'll see a QR code. If you go to the QR code, fill in the form, and then when I share the presentation at the end of this session, you'll be able to see some of the results that have come up during the session, some of those answers. At the end, I'm hoping to be able to do a deep dive into the so what. So the front half, I'm going to explain what these friction factors are. And then at the back end of the presentation, I'm going to say, okay, so what do we do with this information? How do we use it to make our change programs more effective, more successful? And then I've got a resource pack that I can share at the end, as well as a link to the white paper for those of you who have half an hour to spare. So what is resistance? Now, despite the fact that I've used the word about 20 times so far in this presentation already, Nick will be very angry with me because we tend to try and avoid using the word resistance as much as possible at Epion, because it implies that there is some sort of problem with the person resisting, that there's something wrong with them, that they don't get it. We tend to blame them or dismiss them or just label them as difficult. And one of the fundamental principles of the friction factors theory is that if you're going to effectively tackle this resistance to change, first you need to understand what's going on. And it turns out that there are actually some really good reasons why we might resist change, particularly from an evolutionary perspective, how we've evolved and how our brains have evolved. So rather than that left-hand side picture of the work that we do is trying to drag people towards the change or bash them over the head with a stick until they do change. It's far more effective to understand what's going on, focus on removing those psychological barriers, and then naturally it becomes a collaborative process rather than one where it's a fight between you and those you're trying to persuade to change. One caveat, there are types of change that are just unpleasant. If there's a redundancy, if there's a contraction of a particular team and it's going to be really unpleasant for everybody, you're not going to be able to get people jumping for joy. However, you might be able to avoid those situations that I'm sure we've all seen, where an organisation might spend sometimes millions on a new system or a new operating model, and they get the fraction of the value because of this concept of resistance and people just sticking to old ways of working. So hopefully we can avoid some of that. So first friction factor and first question for you. I'm going to provide a bit of context here. Imagine that you're in a conversation with your boss on Teams, or it could be even a family member, a friend on text or WhatsApp, and you're just having a chat, and then suddenly you get this message that says, please call me as soon as you pick this up. So if you go to the QR code, you can enter some of the adjectives, some of the emotions to describe how you might feel in that situation. I'm going to go on to the next screen and you'll see that the live aspect of the quiz isn't working, but at the end you'll see those results will be part of the presentation and part of the pack that I share. What I tend to find here is that the sorts of adjectives people use are worried, anxious, scared, uncertain, unsure. Oh my goodness, what are they going to say? And really, these are very emotionally charged adjectives, particularly given that we're in a work context, right? And very few of us, I think, are, surgeons or saving lives or in life and death situations. And yet sometimes the emotions can feel really profound. Your heart's racing, perhaps you get a pit in your stomach. And this is a fear response. And that's the first of the friction factors, F for fear. What's interesting here is that it's not the change itself that we fear. So lots of times you'll hear people say that people are afraid of change, they're scared of change. It's not actually the change itself, it's the uncertainty that comes with it. Our brains have evolved to like things to be nice and predictable. Predictability equals safety. If I know what's going to happen tomorrow, on an evolutionary basis, I'm more likely to survive, right? Because I'm going to be able to know I can get food, water, etc., etc. So we've evolved to see predictability as safe and uncertainty as danger. And what happens in this situation is that tiny little red dot on the picture is called the amygdala. It's responsible for our fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response, which is a very, very instinctive response. It's very, very old, that part of the brain. It was one of the earliest evolutionary adaptations. It is sometimes called the lizard brain, and it evolved before our mammalian brain evolved on top, and then our human brain, the prefrontal cortex, evolved on top of that. So it's very instinctive. And if you've ever had, for example, a near miss when you're driving, you'll know that sensation, that it's a really physical sensation. Your heart is racing. Perhaps you get a prickly feeling on your skin. Perhaps you flush. And there was an interesting study done on this. What they did was they said, I'm going to give you a financial reward tomorrow. And the financial reward is either going to be £1 or £100. So objectively speaking, it's a gain. In both of those situations, you would expect people to feel, perhaps more positive about the £100, but £1 is still £1 you didn't have yesterday. However, what they actually found was that humans had a stress response in that situation, despite the fact that they knew both of the outcomes were going to be positive. So that's interesting, right? That's showing that it's the uncertainty that people are afraid of rather than the change itself. And as change practitioners, what that means for us is, let's reduce the uncertainty first as a priority to the extent that we possibly can. And I'll go into more details about how to do that at the back end of the presentation. So that's friction factor one, fear, right? Fear of change. But not everybody is afraid of change in quite the same way or to quite the same extent. Question number two should be on your screen. So if you go to the top right QR code, this is a question that asks, how many houses have you lived in your life? Now, my answer is over 20, which kind of makes sense because I work in change. I quite like change. And this concept relates to our predisposed level of change receptiveness. The second of the friction factors is change receptiveness. And what that means is that within any given social group, any given population, you're going to have a spread of different predisposed levels of change receptiveness. You may be familiar with this diffusion of innovation graph that you can see on screen. What you may not know is that unless somebody feels able to correct me, these statistics, the percentages along the bottom are, I think, made up. It was an original theory from the 60s. It was refreshed in Crossing the Chasm more recently in the 90s, but I've dug around to try and find the basis for this. It doesn't exist. So it was a marketing tool originally. So I think it was for that reason they just put some stats next to it. However, what I did find was some really interesting data around risk tolerance. So if we can largely correlate change receptiveness with risk tolerance or risk aversion, the data showed that about 5% and only 5% of people are risk positive, which means that they find risky situations quite exciting. Everybody else, the rest of the 95%, ranged from risk neutral to strongly risk averse. And it showed a very similar distribution to the graph that you've seen on screen. So I think we can say we can use this as a shorthand. It's a well-known theory, it's a well-known model, and has a rough correlation with this concept of risk aversion or risk tolerance. And from an evolutionary perspective, this kind of makes sense when you think about it. You want, within any given social group, to have a few people who are excited by risk, because they're going to go off and do kind of risky, dangerous, might lead to opportunities for the group. So in a Viking society, for example, you want a few people who are going to hop in a longboat and they're going to sail across the Atlantic. Very risky, very dangerous, but might lead to some really significant opportunities. If everybody jumps in a Viking longboat and tries to sail across the Atlantic, you don't end up with many Vikings left. So you need that distribution across the curve. What I want to highlight here is this category of laggards at the end. So in modern change initiatives, we're familiar with this term and we tend to demonize this group. So these laggards, they're the problem, right? They're the problem to be dealt with. But there's some really interesting evidence that throughout history, there have been specific roles across multiple different geographies, across multiple different societies. So you've got an example of mnemones, which were these Greek scholars whose job was to remember contractual information in a time before writing. So they literally had to remember the precise terms of the contract. You had the bardic traditions in England. So these individuals who would remember these incredibly long genealogies, these long histories. You had West African griots, you had the songmen and the song women of Aboriginal cultures. These are geographically dispersed, they're dispersed through time. So there's something clearly important from a social point of view with this role. This role is important. So if we kind of flip the way that we normally think about laggards on its head, we can start to think of them rather as being a problem to being those who protect vital and valuable information. Within an organisational context, they are the holders of the corporate memory, the corporate culture, and they protect the organisation from changing too quickly or changing in a way that might be harmful to the group as a whole, or might risk losing some of that valuable knowledge that's built up over a really long time. So rather than calling them laggards, I prefer to call them custodians. They are the custodians of the organisational culture, and I've got some suggestions later on of how you can really effectively engage this group. Right, question number 3. What is a bad habit that you struggle to break? My bad habit is chocolate. Not a particular fan of crisps. You can give me as many crisps as you like, but chocolate is something I eat most days. And it doesn't have to be food related, right? Some people have all sorts of habits. Perhaps it's trying to go to the gym more or get fit, or, you know, there are lots of different habits that I'm sure that we all have something that we think, oh, you know, I wish I could do a little bit less of that. So if you put that, answer that on the QR code, and the answers will come up. Not here. And so this relates to the third of the friction factors, which is inertia. So think of it like you're walking through a forest on a familiar path, and somebody tells you that actually there's a better way of getting from where you are to where you want to get to, but it means you're going to have to cut through the forest. Perhaps you have the tools, perhaps you have a machete or whatever. So you know that it's possible and you can do it, but it's going to take a lot of effort. And you know, we all know that if you do that every single day, then over time, that new pathway will become the way that you go. And it might be a better way. It might actually be quicker. The old path will become overgrown. And that's the success. That's what we're looking for. However, while you go through that process, it's really energy intensive. And the first time you do it, it's going to take a really long time. And the second time you do it, it's going to take a really long time. And actually 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times, it's going to be harder than the previous way that you did things. And guess what? If time is tight and you really, really, really desperately need to get from A to B, what are you going to do? You're going to take the old path because it's easy and you need to get there. This is important because this concept of inertia is a very different type of resistance than the 2 types that we've dealt with before. So if we think about fear of change, if we think about people who are naturally risk averse or change averse, which is most of us, those are negative emotions that we associate with the change, and we might actively push back on it. I call it intentional resistance. Inertia is unintentional, and it holds true even if we are completely fully bought into the change. This is why, by way of example, if we don't understand what type of resistance we're actually dealing with, we can end up putting a huge amount of effort into doing the wrong thing. So if the problem is inertia, there is no point talking about benefits. There's no point building out a fantastic champions network to advocate for the change, because that's not the problem that you're looking to fix. Here, it's just a case of literally rewiring neural pathways to embed the new ways of thinking, the new learning, the new messages, the new way of thinking. So this is important, because you can end up spending an awful lot of time and effort up until go live, let's say. Then the project team disperses, and all of that effort ends up getting wasted, not because anybody's particularly feeling negative about the change, just because they're getting sucked back into those old patterns of thought, those old neural ways of thinking. So our final friction factor is something that I don't know if it's something that is genuinely getting worse, or it just feels like it's getting worse. But it's something that's really come to the fore, I think, in recent years. And that is capacity, change capacity. This is also another type of unintentional resistance, in the fact that it holds true even when people feel positive about a change. So again, I'm going to give you an analogy. Think of it like a river. So a river can process a certain amount of a certain volume of water over time, right? Water flows naturally through the river, depending on how broad or how deep that river is. And humans are the same in terms of our reaction to change. So we can naturally process changes in our lives, in our work lives, in our personal lives. Perhaps if there's one big change within the organisation every year, we could do that. We'd be comfortable with that. But if too much water is flowing in from the top, from the source of the river, that river is going to flood. Or if the river gets blocked up with rubbish like this picture, so if there's shopping trolleys, tree branches, whatever, and that river gets clogged, it's also going to burst its banks. So that's what we're looking to avoid here, because when that river bursts its banks, when people become overloaded and overwhelmed, they are not able to process anything, right? And all of your change initiatives are going to stall or fail. So if we extend this analogy, there are two ways you can stop your people from becoming overwhelmed and overloaded. You can remove the rubbish that's blocking the flow, or you can reduce the amount of change that's pouring in from the top. And in this context, the rubbish that I'm talking about equates with the theory of cognitive load. So it's sort of like mental bandwidth that we have to process information in the moment. And this relates to both the cognitive load of communications and the cognitive load of training collateral that you might create, or learning collateral. So by reducing the cognitive load, it's like taking rubbish out of the river. It makes it easier for that flow. It makes it easier for people to absorb information related to the change, first of all, and then retain it, remember it over the long term. And in the section coming up, I've got some tips on doing that. However, there is no escaping the fact that even a free-flowing river will overflow if there's too much water pouring in from the top. What's important here, and I think this relates to this feeling that this is getting worse, is that it's not just about change going on within an organisational context. You also have to consider people have changes in their personal lives that you might not even be aware of. You have things like technology change, AI is the latest thing, or digitalisation. You have macroeconomic uncertainty, geopolitical tensions, societal change. All of these things are like tributaries pouring into that river. And when you think of it in that context, there's no wonder that we're hearing this concept of change fatigue more and more. We're hearing about burnout. We're hearing about mental health crisis in the workforce. And I think this concept of capacity for change is largely behind this. We just cannot process as much as we're being expected to process. So we have these four types of change resistance. We have these intentional types of resistance on the left, driven by fear of uncertainty, importantly, and underlying levels of change receptiveness. And then on the right-hand side, we've got this unintentional resistance, which is inertia, pulling us back into what's familiar and against what's new, or simply just having no more capacity to take on anything more. So I'd like you to take a moment to perhaps jot down some notes, which of these types of resistance you're seeing in your teams or seeing in your projects. Which ones do you think might be the hardest ones to address? Make some notes if you like. I'm going to move on to a deep dive now into the so what. Okay, so we've got these four types of resistance. What do we do about it? What might be some tips to include? I will say that there is loads more in the white paper. I tried to make it really practical. I tried to make it not about marketing fluff, which a lot of white papers are. It was really intended to provide some concrete guidance for those leading change, and some of the theory behind it, the science, the studies, the research that backs it up. So it's not just my opinion, if you like. So deep dive. Friction factor 1, fear. I think I would say that if you could only do one, it would and should be fear, and it should be first. It should be the thing that you tackle first, this fear of uncertainty. Why I say that is that when your people are in a state of chronic fear, or chronic uncertainty, prolonged uncertainty, the body releases the stress hormone cortisol. And the research shows that cortisol does a number of interesting things and very relevant things in a change context. So firstly, and this is less related to change, but it's of interest nonetheless, if you have a rush, high levels of cortisol, it actually promotes the formation of memories, strong memories. So that's why if you experience a fearful event, something that scares you, you're more likely to remember that. And that makes sense from an evolutionary point of view, because we want to remember the things that are dangerous or scary because we want to avoid them in future. That's what's going to keep us safe. However, cortisol does another couple of things in the moment. Firstly, it reduces our capacity, the cognitive load, increases the cognitive load and reduces the amount of information that we can process. So that's why you can sometimes get that tunnel vision in a highly stressful situation where we just can't process any more information. We can't really hear what's being said to us. Secondly, it prevents, or it reduces our ability to retrieve memories from our long-term memory. So our working memory is overloaded and we can't then retrieve information that we've previously stored. What that means on change programs is they're not listening to the communications, they're not absorbing those messages, and they can't remember the training that they might have done yesterday or the day before, because that cortisol is blocking that ability. So the first thing is really to say, okay, what can I do to address this uncertainty? So, for example, I did a project a long time ago now with an airline. They were going through a redundancy process, and the leadership, HR, legal, they were saying, let's not say anything because the unions are involved. If we say the wrong thing, it could be a huge risk and it could completely derail these negotiations. And I said, look, like the quote on screen says, speculation loves a vacuum. And people will almost certainly imagine things are happening that are far worse than what's actually going on behind closed doors. So I said, look, we don't have to tell people a lot of detail. Just tell people what we know, what we don't know, give people certainty about when we're going to be able to communicate. What I did was I had a weekly newsletter and it went out precisely the same time every single week, regardless of whether there was a lot to say. And so people had that certainty that something was going to come. They were going to get some form of information. So that's an example of how you might want to do that. Do it in a predictable way, predictable format, and do it, follow through by doing what you say. Second, in terms of receptiveness, really interesting research it was originally done by a woman called Rosabeth Kanter. It was summarized in a more recent book by Malcolm Gladwell, I think it's his most recent one that he's released. And it's this idea of the magic quarter, which relates to change, often big societal change. And what it says is, until you get 25% of people actively advocating for a change, it feels like walking through treacle. It feels like you're making no progress at all. And yet when you hit that magic 25-ish, I mean, it might be 24, it might be 27, but it's around about 25%, the change will snowball. And this has happened in, for example, seatbelt use. There was a time nobody wore a seatbelt. Drink driving, there's a time when it was really common to have 2 or 3 pints and then hop in the car. It happened most recently in the general acceptance of gay marriage. You had this period where nobody thought anything was going to change. You hit 25%, and then suddenly, in a really, really short space of time, everyone's kind of on board. The problem with this, if you've been paying attention, is that if you've got the laggards or the custodians at the end and they're against the change, they're often quite vocally against the change. And so they essentially are doing exactly the same thing. They're just pulling in the opposite direction. So this is yet another reason why it's so important to engage this group in particular, because otherwise you're in this kind of tug of war situation. And typically what happens on change programs is We build a champions network and we focus on the front end of the curve. I've got two kind of tips here, or two observations. The first is that what we tend to do is we focus on those innovators at the front. They love change. They get really excited about it. The problem is they are not always the best because they tend to sign up for everything. So 10 years ago, when champions were first becoming a thing, you'd get somebody, they'd be totally focused on your change. They'd put a huge amount of effort into it. They'd be highly effective. Now you've got the same individuals they're the DEI champion, they're the super user, they're the change champion for your project and 3 or 4 other projects. They're overloaded. They don't have time to do the job well. It's not always in their skill set, particularly if it's, super users who need to be very technical. So it can be effective here to actually focus on those early adopters, early majority. And sometimes it can help to split up the roles. So, for example, your senior leaders are very time poor, but they make great advocates. So if they have a very small job, then roles like PAs and EAs tend to be very, very well connected. So they can be great at cascading communications. And then you might have somebody who's more of a technical person who would make a great super user, for example. So actually, instead of having champions being all of those things, you're splitting up the responsibilities, which means that each individual has more capacity to then support that change. So that's point number one. Point number two around the laggards or the custodians is that, so this is hard, right? This is not an easy fix at all. They have a really high bar for the changes that they will support, because remember, their job is to do that. Their job is to block change until they are sure that it's in the best interest of the organization as a whole. However, they also tend to be people who they know the organization inside out. They have really long tenures. They've been there forever. They understand the informal power structures. They understand the informal communications channels. And they tend to be the police of, quotes, the way we do things around here. So they will actively police the corporate culture, the company culture. And so what you can do to work with this group effectively is, firstly, respect that information, respect that role, respect that they have a valuable part to play, and that what they're doing is not being difficult. They're doing it for really good reasons. Secondly, give them the role of critical friend. So ask them to specifically tell you why the change won't be successful. And then you've got your to-do list, right? If you can address all of those issues, then that's helpful. That's really useful information. And then finally, you can ask them what would need to be true for them to support the change. Because again, once you get that commitment from them, if you can address those issues, they're going to support the change, and suddenly they become very effective police for you. So they're going to be enforcing your change far more readily, far more heavily than perhaps some of the other roles on this curve. So that's some ideas for what you can do for that particular group. Right, so inertia, third of the friction factors. So this is around rewiring people's brains, essentially. The Ebbinghaus forgetting curve has been around since the early 20th century. It's been revalidated many times. The point is, if you don't reinforce learning, you forget most of what you learn within 3 days, right? And so there's a load of tips in the white paper about how this works and what you can do about it and the basis for it. I like this stat on the left-hand side. There's a big caveat. So it's research done by Philippa Lally. There was huge variation. So some habits took 8 days, some habits took 254 days, right? So if it's a very complex change, it's going to take a lot longer to embed than one that's super simple. Having said that, roughly the median was around 66 days, which equates to about 2 months, which was backed up by another research paper that roughly hit the 2-month mark as well. So essentially, if that becomes your baseline to say, I mustn't have a situation where as soon as the project ends, as soon as we hit go live, we have 3 weeks of hypercare and then everyone goes off their merry way. Instead, just ensuring that there's that full 2-month period of daily reinforcement to make sure that you're addressing the forgetting curve. Please remove the old way of doing things if you can. That can be incredibly helpful too. And final friction factor being capacity. So as a reminder, there's a couple of things that we can do to address change capacity. We can do less change, which is like reducing the flow of water into the river at the top, or we can minimize the cognitive load that's associated with that change, which is like removing rubbish from the river that's blocking the flow of water. We can reduce the cognitive load of absorbing new messages and learning by making it really easy, as easy as possible. On the left-hand side, this was a fantastic example of this process in practice, because advertising is highly incentivized to find the most effective way of getting a message from paper into your brain. That is advertising's job. And this was a nice kind of meta example of what we're looking to do on communications as well. So instead of a 3-line sentence, just summarize it. Our ingredients are better. That's the message that billboard is looking to communicate. So you can do that. So make it short, make it visually engaging, keep language simple, avoid jargon, use storytelling. So there is a very good reason why you will probably remember almost nothing from this presentation, but you might remember the river analogy. You might remember walking through a forest. You might remember the example of when I talk about a driving near miss and that jolt of cortisol or adrenaline that you get. There's reasons why I've used those analogies, right? Because they're easier to remember. And I think within communications, remember that it's not a competition to show how clever you are. I see this a lot with leaders who they will create communications that are beautifully written, lots of fancy words, but remember that every single word is eating into your people's attentional capacity. So use them wisely, use them carefully and intentionally. And it's the same rules for training material or learning material. Lots of the same ideas hold true about making it visually engaging. On the right-hand side, this is HMRC's tax return form. And much of the site I cannot stand, but this form is incredibly simple. It's really simple questions, 1 question per page, big buttons, great big buttons, and then that green continue button. And that's pretty much it, right? You do 1 question, you go on to the next, you do the next question. It's not some huge long form that you have to fill in. So that can help, as can chunking up the learning into smaller pieces. So you're reinforcing regularly. I'm not expecting people to read this, but do take a look if you want to laugh when I send through the slides. I asked ChatGPT to create a really, really bad communication for me. Basically, this email is saying you're all going to lose your jobs. But it's not saying it in quite that way. So it's long, it's full of acronyms, it's got no empathy, it's, very distant, and it's really difficult to actually figure out what's going on. And unfortunately, I see a lot of this on change programs, and you think, what are you actually trying to say here? What's the message that you're trying to communicate? So have a look at that if you want at the end. So that is a summary. I'm going to leave 5 minutes for questions at the end, but I am going to stay on until the top of the hour if people want to. In terms of the summary of what we covered today, reactions to change are hardwired. There's an evolutionary basis for lots of how we behave, or a neurobiological basis. Resistance can be either intentional, unintentional, and this is something that we can often miss when we're thinking about resistance. You've got that fear of uncertainty or predisposed levels of change receptiveness in terms of intentional resistance, but then you also have both inertia and a lack of change capacity to deal with. So if you can think about what's going on and why people are resisting, which of these things might be at play, you're going to be much more effective in addressing those issues in a supportive and helpful way. But it takes time, but it's not easy. And for that reason, I would say, please, 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 if there's one thing, if you have any control over a change portfolio, do a few changes well, rather than overwhelm your team's finite capacity and risk none of them landing at all or that effectively. So next steps, there's a free resource pack, which I will send around. There's a link to the white paper there, which is also on our website. Feel free to schedule a follow-up with me if you like. And that is it. So thank you very much for your time. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to either put your hand up now or drop them into the chat and I will get to them now.